Okay, I appreciate everybody showing up tonight. I'm sure you're very familiar with our guest, Stanton Friedman. He became interested in UFOs in 1958. He was the first civilian investigator for the Roswell incident. He was involved heavily with the Barney and Betty Hill case. He researched the Majestic 12 and published a very interesting book on that subject. Also, he recently received a Lifetime Achievement Award. And I appreciate you very much for joining us tonight. Stan, how are you doing this evening?
My pleasure here in beautiful Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada, 73 miles east of downtown Holton, Maine. End of I-95, for people who don't know where that is.
Excellent. All right. Well, we've got some questions that we've compiled from the people that are on the forum and some people in the chat room. What we're going to do is go back and forth. I'm going to read a question from the forum, and then we're going to have one of the chatters ask you a question themselves, if that's okay.
That's fine.
All right. The very first question, some of these questions are to you personally, and some of them are for your work, but I don't think we're going to get into anything too controversial here. So here's the first question.
Oh, what a shame.
Well, maybe we'll try and squeeze in a couple then. Have you ever had any personal sightings or interactions with UFOs yourself, sir?
No, I thought I did once. Kathleen Marden and I, we wrote the book, Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. We were being interviewed out in the woods in New Hampshire, not far from where their experience took place. And we're off the road, and the guy's on the road, and it's dark at night, trees, nobody around. And suddenly the cameraman, who's about 50 feet ahead of us, says, "What's that behind you?" This never happens during an interview, so we naturally look up, and there's a light over there, and it goes out, and then there's a light a little further to the right of that, and it goes out, and then another one, several of them. And we didn't know what it was, but for a moment there we thought somebody was paying attention to us. We get back to the hotel, and a couple of waitresses said, "We got to talk to you," because they had a sighting, and they drew a little sketch, daytime. This is 15 miles away. Mm-hmm. And it was exactly what we had seen, this pattern. So we talked to Peter Jeremiah, who was very active in MUFON at that time, and he did a lot of checking, and it sounded like it was flare drops by the Vermont Reserve National Guard, really. And I'm satisfied with that. I certainly didn't see any reason to say it was an alien spacecraft, but it was a strange experience. I think it's even on YouTube, because they filmed us while we were talking. So that's as close as I've come, which isn't close at all.
Well, that's interesting. It's inspiring that you've had such faith in the UFO field and had such little interaction with it yourself, personal experiences. Next question. In your book, Science Was Wrong, you take your critics to task pretty well. I'm familiar with it, and it's an excellent read, and I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
How do you get over the public ridicule that you get for being a UFO researcher?
Well, I don't get any. I've had only 11 hecklers and well over 700 lectures, and 2 of them were drunk. And I'm told you'll get that many if you talk about sports, religion, politics. I don't have a problem with that. And I've major universities, professional groups, engineering societies of Detroit, Cincinnati, other places, sections of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, the American Nuclear Society at Los Alamos, the local section of the ANS. We had over 500 people, no negative questions. Engineering Society of Detroit, that's one of the things that really got me going, was we had over 1,000 people sold out in advance 3 weeks for dinner and a talk, and there wasn't one negative question. So it's not a problem. I'm not an apologist, ufologist. I tell it like it is. And that's one of the many misconceptions, although it's primarily responsible for people not talking about their sightings. When I check my audiences at the end of my lecture, I would never do it at the beginning. I don't have courage enough for that. How many people here believe they've seen what I would consider to be a flying saucer? I've defined my terms early on. And I will say something like, we didn't let the CIA in. It's okay. I'm not asking for your name. I'm just going to point and count. And I start doing that as the hands go up slowly. By the time I get over the other side of the hall, the hands go up vigorously. Each one thought he was the only one. 10% of the people believe they've had sightings. But then I ask, how many of you reported what you saw? 90% of the hands go down. If anybody left, I'll ask, want to tell us about it? I'll ask if they were in the military, because I'm looking for those cases.
Sure.
And I get some very interesting reports. So, well, I'll give you one. A pilot, Air Force pilot, he raised his hand, and I said, look, you don't need to stand up. I won't ask your name and stuff, but I'm sure the audience would like to hear about your experience, because he's indicated he's had a sighting and he was in the military at the time. He was flying a 4-engine aircraft over the Pacific in the Air Force, and plane 20 miles ahead, radios back, saucer heading your way. They had gun cameras. They took pictures. They radioed the base to which they were going, because film is not handled by the crew. It's intelligence stuff, and it's only handled by the guys at the other end. And when they landed, the film got taken, and they got debriefed and told never to say anything. And I'm sure everybody in that audience believed the guy. He was obviously sincere. He didn't stand up. He wasn't looking for publicity. He was being honest. Of course, I had another case where a guy in front of 1,300 people, and I said, you want to tell us about it? He'd been in the military. He'd had a sighting. I can't. They told me not to say anything, which was a great line. So ridicule is something in the minds of the debunkers. They hope they can get everybody to think that this is kooky-quacky, no sense to it. But the survey polls, if you look at my book, Flying Saucers and Science, there's a chapter on what do people think about UFOs. Because there have been a lot of polls, Gallup polls, stuff like that. The greater the education, the more likely to believe in flying saucers. And you do get the strange situation where I check in a classroom. I do a lot of classroom visits, and 80% thought some UFOs were alien spacecraft in that class. And yet 80% thought that they, what was the term that I used, that they thought most people didn't believe in UFOs. So that's a big contrast. Most people do believe in UFOs, but they think other people don't, so they act accordingly. They don't say anything. So if we can lift the laughter curtain, we really won a lot of territory. So it's not a problem for me. I don't have a target painted on my head. Admittedly, occasionally you get somebody. I got a guy, first one up in the question and answer period, gentleman, well-dressed, says, I've never heard so much nonsense in one night in my life. What a great way to start the question and answer period. So I fortunately said, could you be a bit more specific, please? You said that Betty and Barney Hill were taken to Zeta Reticuli and back in 2 hours. Sorry, sir. What I said was they were taken on board a craft for 2 hours. They didn't go anywhere. He gives me 2 more you said that's, which were totally wrong. Finally, somebody in the audience says, how about taking some sensible questions? This guy gets up, walks out, and I said, I'll take your question, but who was that? He was a professor of physics. He hadn't heard what I said at all. I had another situation at a Gulf Research Labs Management Club dinner. And a guy interrupts me, why don't you talk about something or other? And I said, I'll be talking about that later. And a second time, and a third time, and finally the boss, president of the organization, says, let him finish. So I finished, and I turned to this guy. He says, well, I'm sure one could come to other conclusions than the ones you've come to. I said, well, let me see now. As I recall, you hadn't read any of those 5 large-scale scientific studies that I talked about, right? Well, yes. Well, that's the difference between us, isn't it? I gave you my conclusions. I gave you the data, the sources of data on which I based those conclusions. You haven't read any of them. I've read them all. Whose opinion is worth more? Long silence. So it really isn't a problem. Now, I have to tell you my Miss Gutkin experience, which accounts for all of this. Rose Gutkin taught 4th grade and then 5th grade. The teacher left, and she moved with our class, moved up to 5th grade. And she is telling us one day in a science class, and she says the sun stands still and the planets and everything else moves around the sun. And I said, no, Miss Gutkin, I just read it in the encyclopedia. We bought them for 49 cents a volume back then at the supermarket. And I just read there, and it says the whole solar system is moving 12 miles a second around the center of the galaxy. That seems awful fast to me. Oh, no, that's not right. That's not what it says here, blah, blah, blah. Well, I never asked a teacher, and I wasn't accustomed to having a teacher give me a hard time, so I didn't say anything. But the next day, I brought in the encyclopedia, and she read it. Well, maybe that's right after all, but it taught me a very big lesson. Have facts in hand before putting mouth in gear. I was in high school debating, and it came in handy there, too. And it's one of the things I've found that I enjoy lecturing. I'm a Leo. I like being on the stage. But I found that my memory was very good, at least until recently. I'm an old guy now. And I could respond quickly to any question that got asked, and I could trust my memory. And that's nice when you're on the stage. You can't say, well, I'll get back to you tomorrow, with an answer to the question. So anybody who's interested in becoming a flying saucer physicist on the stage, go to it, but get your facts first.
Excellent. Yeah, it definitely helps. The oratory skills to be in debate. Debate was my lead subject in high school, so I'm familiar with that. And also in speaking with the people thinking that other people don't believe in UFOs, I think there's a lot to be said about the internet expanding people's awareness and letting people know that they're not necessarily alone in their beliefs, and it's creating that community that's galvanizing it a little bit.
Well, look at all the stuff on television. The producers of television shows know darn well that people are interested.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
I mean, even if the New York Times doesn't cover the subject adequately, or the Washington Post, let me tell you a little story about that, and I'm still curious about it. Back in 1952, which was Project Blue Book's biggest year, military orders were issued to military pilots. Shoot down UFOs if they don't land when instructed to do so. You can think of a lot of cartoons, but I won't go into that. Anyway, the guy's name, a military officer's name, was mentioned about that, and General Roger Ramey, who was involved in Roswell, stated he had moved up a couple of ranks. He stated that we've scrambled planes more than 300 times. But it is interesting that story was not covered by either the New York Times or the Washington Post. And a lot of other newspapers. And, President Kennedy said he wished the New York Times had run the story about the invasion of Cuba, and maybe we could have avoided that debacle.
Sure.
So there is one of the dozen PhD theses, so it's probably more than that now, about UFOs, was press coverage of the subject. And the guy who wrote it had strong comments to make about the inadequacy, inaccuracy, failure to do their homework of the press coverage. He read, it's hard to believe, he read 10,000 clippings. I wouldn't wish that on anybody. But he was dean of the School of Journalism at University in Iowa. So, he wasn't a slouch. And it is a problem, but they're getting better. Max Planck, a big German physicist a long time ago, said, new ideas come to be accepted, not because their opponents come to believe in them, but because their opponents die and a new generation grows up that's accustomed to them. He didn't say understands them, he said accustomed to them.
Sure.
And what I find, and I've recently given lectures like a new look at the cosmos, with the Kepler space satellite dredging up new planets all the time. It's shut off right now, but it certainly found data on lots of them. And it only looks at a hunk of the sky about the size of your fist at arm's length if you hold it out in front of you. It goes out and back and out and back, and it's a beautiful device. It's like being able to spot a butterfly going in front of a car headlight a mile away and see the difference in light intensity. It's great. And suddenly, the younger generation certainly thinks that there's life all over the place out there. What's special about here? And that's changed. The SETI people, silly effort to investigate, got to get that in there, SETI. They think there's guys out there, a few of them. Frank Drake said there might be as many as 8,000 places in the galaxy that could send signals. Why they would and why they would use technology appropriate to us who have only had long-distance radio since 1901, I don't know. But now a better number for the galaxy, this is just our own galaxy, would probably be 8 billion places. So it takes us down off our high place in our own esteem if you stop to look at this reasonably. Let's hope, and if you want to get religious on me, let's hope God has found a better civilization to imbue with reverence than ours. We're going to spend $1 trillion this year on things military, and thousands of kids die every single day. We killed 50 million people during World War II. We destroyed basically 1,700 cities. And I mention this because people say, why would they come here? Why don't they land on the White House lawn? It's a no-fly zone, for one thing. And the President of the United States, now I know this is going to shock people, the President of the United States doesn't speak for 7 billion Earthlings. Sometimes he has trouble speaking for 310 million Americans, But one good reason for coming here is because any smart alien would realize, and I'll give you 3 reasons for this, that soon, less than 100 years, we idiot Earthlings are going to be able to go out there and take our brand of friendship, hostility. The 3 things are nuclear weapons, powerful rockets used to kill people, not to deliver mail, and powerful radar, which is the beginning of the electronics revolution. It just really began just before World War II. Isn't it amazing that the only place in the world in July 1947 where you could check on all 3 of those technologies was southeastern New Mexico that I just got back from for the Roswell Festival. Roswell's in southeastern New Mexico. And I had an English astronomer, a very haughty English astronomer, say, well, they could have gone to the Soviet Union. I had to say, sorry, they didn't test their first A-bomb until 1949. In other words, there's been a huge change. You can see it most easily maybe in thinking about destroying, which we're good at. A big bomb in 1944 was a 10-ton blockbuster, 10 tons of dynamite. It took a big B-29 to carry it. First atomic bomb next year, 1945, in Trinity Site in New Mexico on the White Sands Missile Range. Released the energy of something like 16,000 tons of TNT. And then 7 years later, which is nothing on a cosmic timescale, we set off our first fusion device, an H-bomb, released the energy of 10 million tons of TNT. So we go from 10 to 16,000 to 10 million in less than 10 years. And that shows you, it tells you a lot about us. And for those who say, but you can't get here from there, Stan, what difference does it make? I would point out that nuclear energy for propulsion is very important to us. First nuclear submarine can go around the world underwater. In World War II, a submarine was a surface ship that could stay below for 24 hours, run out of air for the engines. All the way around the world, underwater. You take periscope leave when you go by Hawaii, incidentally, and wave at the girls on the beach. The Navy also operates very large aircraft carriers that are nuclear powered. They carry about 75 little airplanes who can operate for about 2 hours on the fuel they can carry. The aircraft carrier can operate for 18 years without refueling.
Good golly.
That's quite impressive. I mean, realize we didn't figure out about fusion until 1938, and then it was theoretical. So we've come a long way, baby, as somebody would say. And any sensible alien would say, hey, we don't want those idiots out here. Because incidentally, I said 10 million tons of TNT for our first H-bomb. The Russians set one off that was over 50 million tons of TNT equivalent. And if you drop that in the middle of New Jersey, you would set fires from Philadelphia to New York. Some people would say, hey, that's not such a bad idea, Stan. I grew up in New Jersey, and I can understand that point of view. What I'm trying to say here is my mantra is that technological progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. The future is not an extrapolation of the past. A laser isn't just a better light bulb. Entirely different physics. The nuclear weapons, entirely different physics from chemical bombs. One problem, of course, is that the ancient academics and fossilized physicists don't seem to understand that advanced technology is being developed in industry in the national labs, not in academia. They think the only place research goes on is in academia. And I've had two different people tell me, Stan, look, if Roswell really happened, then they would have had to pull half the physicists out of the colleges across the country. I say, you've got to be kidding. The national labs, Los Alamos had 7,000 people working there. Then there's Sandia, Livermore, Hanford, Oak Ridge. Loads of people who not only were very smart and very talented, but had appropriate security clearances. Mm. And, people say, well, governments can't keep secrets. That's a pretty dumb thing to say. Let me give you just one example. The Corona spy satellite, our first successful spy satellite. The first success was in 1960 after 12 failures in secret, incidentally. They had cover stories. The first one got more data about Soviet military installations than all the U-2 aircraft that had preceded them. But there was nothing said in public until 1995. 1960 was the first one. Done in secret and spending lots of money. People don't understand that research is more than 4 professors and 20 grad students at some university. When I was working on nuclear airplanes at General Electric in Cincinnati, GE Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Department said right on the door, 1958, we spent $100 million. We had 3,500 employees, of whom 1,100 were engineers and scientists. It was great fun. The program got canceled like everything else worked on. Well, almost everything else. But, that's a medium-sized program. $100 million, and for those who aren't old enough to remember 1958, was a lot of money in 1958.
Sure, absolutely.
That wasn't small potatoes. So there's a lot of misrepresentation by the nasty, noisy negativists, and especially by the academics, and especially by the astronomers who, for whatever reason, seem bound and determined to show how uninformed they are about the real world in which we live. Another example, 1941, Professor Campbell in Canada, an astronomer, was sick and tired of all this science fiction stuff about going to the moon. How absurd. So he did a scientific paper, published in a journal, in which he calculated the required initial launch weight of a rocket able to get a man to the moon and back. Lots of equations. Bottom line, it would have to weigh, at launch, 1 million tons. Ha, ha, ha.
Whoa.
And the trouble is that he made every possible stupid assumption. And our Apollo, the Saturn V rocket, which took us to the moon and back, weighed 3,000 tons. The right answer was 3,000. The wrong answer by this learned professor was 1 million tons. How could he be so wrong? Well, he made all the wrong assumptions because he didn't know anything about space travel. He assumed a single-stage rocket. Now, Tsiolkovsky, back in 1920, Dr. Goddard, all the experts knew it would take other than a single-stage rocket, typically 3 stages. He assumed too low an acceleration. He assumed that the rocket would have to supply all the energy, forgetting that, the moon has a gravitational field. If you get near enough, it'll pull you in, free.
Sure.
Cosmic freeloading, I call it. He assumed that if you want to slow down when you come back, and you better because you're going to 5,000 miles an hour, you'd have to carry a retro rocket. Of course, it's dead weight when you take off, and when you slow it down at the moon, and when you launch from the moon, what do? We say, thank you, God, for giving us an atmosphere. It gives us air to breathe, which is very handy, and it allows us to slow the rocket down without using any energy. You gotta be smart. Remember Apollo 13? You better get the angle right, guys, or you're gonna miss the planet or dig a big hole. But I mean, I mention this because it illustrates that well-educated people who don't know what they're talking about can say some awful stupid things. That's where my book, Science Was Wrong, with Kathleen Marden comes in. A lot of examples. And there's something to learn there, in other words. You've got to be a little humble about thinking we know all there is to know, and especially about thinking that guys who don't know anything at all about a particular area of interest can make sensible calculations or prognostications. The British astronomer Royal, in 1956, when asked by Time magazine, space travel is utter bilge. Sputnik went up the next year. He also said that, what we really need to do is build better instruments for astronomy. And the field that has benefited the most from space travel, astronomy. With the Hubble and Chandra and all those other great instruments that are out there. So I respect the accomplishments of real astronomers. I don't respect their pronouncements from on high in which they demonstrate how little they know. They don't have facts in hand before putting mouth in gear, which ought to be the rule, darn it.
Agreed. There's if not the law, then for sure a rule of thumb to live by.
Well, yeah, I learned that. It helps you when you're a performer on the stage. Believe me, it does. Stick to the facts.
Absolutely, just the facts, man.
Yeah.
Okay, our next question is a little bit off topic. It's a question from chat. This person is curious if you've not really had any personal involvement with the UFO personally. What has kept you interested in UFOs and researching and promoting the information for so long?
Well, I think it's the biggest subject you can deal with. Are we alone in the universe? How do you get here from there? What would aliens be like? Can you imagine why they would do this, that, and the other thing? And the response of my audience is, they keep asking questions. Sometimes they have to shut the door because the janitor says, we got to go home, folks. And they respond so well. I mean, I got 5 books out there, and I get loads of good comments about them all. I'm not bragging about that. I'm just saying, I'm not a masochist. I don't do this because I get a hard time. So what could be more exciting? I mean, my involvement in the Betty and Barney Hill case, for example, in the book Captured by Kathleen Marden, Betty's niece, and myself. I put my name first only because the publisher said, Stan, it'll sell more if your name is first because you're better known.
Sure.
Marketing. What do you say to that? You don't say to the publisher, I don't care if it sells. Of course you do. Anyway, that story has I did the story on the star map work that's there. And how I was the first to publish about the wonderful work of Marjorie Fish, who died this April, incidentally, this past April. She was 80 years old. She built more than 20 three-dimensional models of our local galactic neighborhood to see if she could find a match to the map that Betty drew after, under hypnosis, Dr. Benjamin Simon had her relive part of her experience on board the craft, and she talks about seeing the star map, and he asked her if she could remember what it looks like. I wish I knew what he was thinking at the time. What is this crazy story? And Marjorie built all these models, a brilliant woman, and one of the most objective people I've ever met, frankly. And out of that work came the identification of there are 2 stars that are the base stars in the map. Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 Reticuli, everybody's favorite stars. It's the constellation of Reticulum, which means the net in Latin, which I don't speak, but I know that much Latin. And it's interesting to see the contrast between their situation and ours. Here are 2 stars, but you can't see from here. You got to go below the equator. They're in the southern sky constellation of Reticulum. But the 2 stars are only 39.3 light years from here. That's just down the street. But from each other, they're only an eighth of a light year apart. They're 30 times closer to each other than the sun is to the next star over. Around the boonies.
Rock throwing distance.
well, those guys got next door neighbors, but in addition, they're a cool billion years older than the sun. And from a planet around one, looking over at the other, it's visible all day long. And you don't need fancy instruments to be able to learn a lot about the planets that are around those other stars. So you'd probably expect that there'd be earlier interstellar travel when you have a next-door neighbor.
Sure.
And we got a longer time, a billion years ahead of us, earlier, older than us, you'd probably be more likely to develop, interstellar travel. Now, that's exciting work. And I get a kick out of astronomers saying, well, there might be somebody as close as 1,000 light years away. Wow. I'm talking 39 light years away. I had one astronomer start our conversation by saying, oh, when I was young, I thought, wouldn't it be great to go to Andromeda? Then I realized that's another galaxy, which is a cool 2 million light years away. Then I realized how much energy it would take, and I told him, I said, look, I don't care about 2 million light years away. I care about 39. There's a difference. If my wife wants a loaf of bread for dinner, I don't say, honey, I'll be back next week because there's a great bakery in Sydney, Australia, and it'll take me a while to get there.
Let's hope not.
She says, the supermarket's a mile away. We need it for dinner. Yeah.
Sure.
So it's fascinating to get into these things, and I'm very lucky. I did meet Betty and Barney Hill. Barney just 3 months before his death. And for anybody who's scholarly, they can see that there's a lot of important stuff connection with the Betty and Barney Hill cases at the University of New Hampshire. It's in their archives. And scholars can go there and look at the stuff. And the dress that she was wearing when she was abducted is there. Been analyzed and strange stuff on it.
Oh, wow.
So there's excitement with all this stuff. What could be more exciting than that? I mean, sure, I have to admit, I enjoyed working on fission nuclear rockets. And when we tested one successfully, and nobody knew how long the thing would last before it either blew up or had to shut down. And the odds were 10 or 20 minutes. So the limit was 60. And we're listening as they broadcast temperatures, pressure, conditions nominal. This is at Westinghouse. 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 50 minutes. It went the full 60 minutes, excuse me. And that was exciting. But then they canceled the program.
Oh. No good.
And incidentally, the power level of that, our Westinghouse nuclear rocket engine, the N.R.O, had a power level of 1,100 megawatts. Grand Coulee Dam is 2,200 megawatts. Los Alamos operated a bigger one a little later, Phoebus 2B, less than 8 feet in diameter, mind you. Power level was 4,400 megawatts, twice the power of Grand Coulee Dam in a fission nuclear rocket. And this was tested, I shouldn't mention it, but it was out in the nuclear test site not far from Area 51.
Oh, no.
And no, I've never been inside Area 51. I've been by.
I've seen it.
But I saw the sign. I saw the sign that said "Use of deadly force authorized."
Sure, that's enough to run anybody off.
Yeah, and I should say that I was going to a little alien in in a little town in Nevada, Rachel, Nevada. And I had a hamburger with Larry King because we did a show from out there.
All right.
It was interesting. I mean, if you want isolated areas, you go out there. There's not much going on. Just like in New Mexico, you can drive for miles and not see another soul.
Almost like you're on another planet.
It's a different. Yeah. Well, frankly, there was a German science editor who came over. He had contacted me, and I agreed to meet him in Albuquerque and drive him down to Roswell. And as we drove down, it's 200 miles, he couldn't get over the skies. He said, there's no place in Europe with skies this clear. And they go on and on and on. We were watching a comet was up that night. And he says, I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it. It just seemed so incredibly lots of nothing in the ground. In other words, there's no people around, and yet this clear skies. And he could see why you could hide a lot of stuff in New Mexico. So it's been an interesting life for me to see all these interesting places. And what I've found, frankly, is that people all over the world are interested in this question of, are we alone? Anybody coming here? Why the governments act the way they do? That's not a peculiar thing, just the United States. I've been there, from Brazil to Australia to Hong Kong to Saudi Arabia. That was interesting. Turkey, Finland, 18 countries, 50 states, and 10 provinces. And as I say, I'm not a masochist. I get a kick out of the kind of response I get from people all over the world. They're interested, seriously interested.
Absolutely, yeah. That's something that everybody I've ever talked to, I've never known anyone that hasn't been familiar with some type of UFO phenomenon or had their own story for the most part of somebody that's seen something or heard something. Our next question it deals with the Majestic 12. The question. Of course, this is. Is Project Blue Book somewhat related with this, I believe, if I'm not mistaken on that. And your book, Project Blue Book, Special Report for...
No. Project Blue Book Special Report 14 has nothing about Majestic 12.
I apologize. I got my facts a little twisted on there. I'm sorry about that.
Well, close enough. I do have a book, Majestic 12 or MJ12, Top Secret Magic, MAJIC.
I apologize.
And incidentally, keep your eyes open. The movie rights have been optioned for Top Secret Magic. For the movie would be Magic Men, MAJIC. It'll be not a documentary, but it'll be a dynamic show, sort of like JFK and all the President's Men, combined. And I want Richard Dreyfuss to play me, of course. But, he was born in 1947, which I find interesting.
Oh my!
But
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Do they have a question about MJ12?
Yeah, they do. And I just wanted to add for everyone listening that all of Mr. Friedman's books and DVDs are available on his website at StantonFriedman.com. Of course, there's a link in the show thread, and we'll post a link in the chat room for anybody that might not have seen the thread. The question, he has got a statement. First off, much respect for your work on MJ12. The question is, where do you feel the U.S. government stands today in disclosing the repositories of old events, namely N.R.O. and U.S. Naval Intelligence archives?
The government has shown no signs at all of reducing its reliance on high security to keep things secret. People don't seem to be aware of how much classified stuff there is out there. I think I've participated in the CHD, the Citizens Hearing on Disclosure in Washington at the end of April, early May. There was a panel of 6 former congressmen who acted like they were still congressmen and listened to us. We had to prepare presentations, and they asked questions, or 40 of us over a week period. Sort of exhaustive, and we gave lectures at night and so forth. And I am not in favor of releasing everything. People look at me, why not, Stan? Aren't we entitled? And frankly, no. I worked under security for 14 years. There is a strong national security aspect to this. If we have figured out anything technologically, how to make a better flying saucer, a better defense system, an aircraft detection system, whatever, why should we release it if the Russians and Chinese don't release what they have? It just doesn't make sense to me. So I would like to see an international announcement saying that indeed the planet is being visited. It presents a lot of considerations for governments around the world, and we're going to hold conferences over the next few months concerning the philosophical, religious, technological, economic, psychological aspects of the problem. It is clear that we as a society would be able to destroy our planet if the wrong people decide to do so. We need to go from where we are to someplace else. And I hate to remind people of the fact that Oh dear, in World War II we only killed 50 million of our own kind. We destroyed 1,700 cities. That's scary, when you think about that. Kids look at me, what are you talking about? I said, that's the way it was. And one of the things that happened in the First World War, it was trench warfare. Armies opposing each other across the line, so to speak. And it was dirty, it was noisy, it was deadly, but the civilians were off to the side somewhere. Somebody, somehow in the middle 30s, we decided it was okay to kill civilians in Ethiopia and other places. Then we started bombing wholesale, burning the heck out of Japanese cities. Civilians became the target. That's strange. I mean, that shows you how barbaric we are.
Yeah,
it's one thing to have armies doing it, but killing your own people? I have trouble with that. So, the world needs to wake up. And MJ-12, I believe there was such a group, Operation Majestic 12, set up by President Truman in 1947 in response to Roswell. And the people who were on the group were named, and I made some shocking discoveries, even to me, about some of the people. And I think I've dealt with all the objections. The one I got the most kick out of, there was a guy named Philip Klass, who was a nasty, noisy, negativist aviation, senior avionics editor for Aviation Week and Space Technology. There were no flying saucers. He had a prosaic explanation for everything. And one of the MJ-12 documents, there's several, which I think are legitimate, and a whole bunch more, which I think are illegitimate. Anyway, maybe you didn't notice the typeface on that document. It's the large pica type, but the National Security Council used only the small elite type. Here are 9 samples to prove it. I challenge you to find any other genuine documents meeting a bunch of criteria having the same size and style pica type as that MJ-12 document supposedly does. And I'll give you $100 each, up to a maximum of 10, for every genuine document you give me that meets these criteria. Now, of course, he'd never been to the Eisenhower Library. I've spent weeks there, as it happens. And so I was going there a couple weeks later. He gave me 60 days, and I dug out a bunch. It's easy to spot the difference. Pica's big, elite is small. For those of you who aren't accustomed to dealing with typewriters. So I got 14, and I copied them, sent him copies, and an invoice for $1,000, because he said a limit of 10, unfortunately. And he paid me. He told everybody about challenging me, nobody about paying me. And then he got madder than heck when I showed a copy of his check in a publication that I wrote. Threatened to sue me. His father was a lawyer and knew how to write these threatening letters, So I finally told him, I said, Phil, you sent me a check. I Xeroxed the check. I took the check to the bank. The bank cashed it. I can do whatever I darn please with that Xerox. And he shut up. But it is interesting indeed. His papers are at the American Philosophical Society Library in Philadelphia. He's been dead for a number of years, but there is no Friedman file there. We corresponded for more than 20 years. I wonder why.
Sure.
But I haven't found a good argument against the legitimacy of 3 or 4 of the MJ-12 documents, and some of the arguments are stupid. One former military man said, "Oh, you notice that they use generic ranks. They said general when he wasn't a 4-star. They said admiral when he was only a rear admiral, and obviously the documents are phony." Well, it turns out, if you go to the Eisenhower Library and you look up things, that it was standard practice to use generic ranks. President Eisenhower's staff secretary, General Goodpaster, he took notes at all the meetings at the White House, and he would list the attendees at the beginning. And always he used generic ranks, general this, admiral that, including himself. He called himself General Goodpaster. He signs it Brigadier General Goodpaster, and I talked to 2 different archivists. I said, "Does this bother you, this use of generic ranks?" "No, it was standard practice." But here was a military man claiming that that was a reason to reject the documents. There were a lot of other silly arguments, but none of them stand up when you start digging. And they're all in the book. I don't duck any of the arguments. So you can call it a scientific detective story, and if it turns out to be a movie, magic, man.
Yes, I've got my eyes open for
I'm
that.
hoping.
That sounds like it's...
Incidentally, the same people have optioned the other book, Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience.
Mm-hmm.
And that should be interesting, too. I mean, Hollywood's a crapshoot. You don't know whether they're going to make the movie or not. I mean, the script for Magic Man has gone through 4 iterations, but that's no guarantee.
Sure, that's true.
Many start, not many finish.
That's true. Yeah, it's funny when you really dig deep and get granular with some of these things that they feel are valid objections that they just unable to hold any water at all, especially someone talking against their own specific protocols and like that. We've got another question. This one's from chat. This person is interested in. They've seen the craft for themselves. They were with some other people, and they're curious to know if what your opinion is of the Nazis taking control of gravitronics post World War II. How do you feel about that?
I think that's fiction. I think part of it is because there are people who say anything but alien. So looking around, I mean, the silliest was Annie Jacobson's book about Area 51, in which she says Dr. Death made a pact with Joe Stalin to put together some, how shall I say it, injured, defective small beings, kids, and crashed them in New Mexico in a German flying wing, Horton Brothers flying wing, and the point was to duplicate the War of the Worlds panic, 1938, And that, in the first place, there's no evidence at all that Dr. Death made any pact with Stalin. You may remember the Russians and Germans weren't exactly on good terms at that time. Furthermore, the Horton Brothers flying wing made out of wood, and there is only one, and it's at the Smithsonian. And, the 1938 War of the Worlds, the fuss was in New Jersey. I was in New Jersey at the time. I didn't hear the program. I can't say I did. But it's the most densely populated part of the United States. Mm-hmm. And it's a great place to cause a panic. Remember, everybody thought the news program, radio news, this was a news report. My God, Martians have, invaded and they're destroying and so forth and so on. If there's any place that had a right to panic, they did. What can we do about Martians? Mm-hmm. New Mexico with nobody around, and it really is in the middle of nowhere where the crash occurred, the Roswell crash. To think that would cause panic is absurd. And then she said, we couldn't figure out how the craft was made. Well, we knew all kinds of stuff about the German World War II technological effort. We brought back literally tons of paper from testing that they had done. They saved us $50 million because they were good engineers. They ran good tests, lift, drag, all that sort of thing, and atmospherics. So, no, the Germans, the simplest fact that you have to pay attention to is if the Germans had anything like a flying saucer capability, they'd have used it. Sure. Hitler was not known to be a kind guy. Well, we want to spare our enemies. We don't want to do anything to disturb them. What? That ain't the way it was, man.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's absolutely. It's hard to understand. Of course, all of this anti-gravitronics and stuff. This is most of what we have to understand is hearsay because we don't really have anything to nail it down to.
That's right.
So.
Talk
exactly. Have your facts ready before you run your mouth, as a smart man once said. Okay, our next question, this is going to appeal to the physicist in you, hopefully. Since you were a nuclear physicist for 14 years, could you give us your take on Fukushima? Specifically, we're interested in hearing your opinion on of where the corium cores are now.
Well, Look, unfortunately, radiation has gotten a bad rap.
Sure.
It's been assumed, for safety's sake, that any dose of radiation is bad for you. And so even the smallest amount, if you get a lot of people being exposed, is going to kill a lot of people. And it turns out that that simply isn't true. There's a process called hormesis, Hormesis. And this is a situation in which a small dose of something is good for you and a big dose is bad. 2 aspirin will cure your headache. 30 will probably kill you. So, where's the break point in between there? Mm-hmm. And there have been a lot of studies that show that a little radiation is better, and as you get too much, then it gets worse. And there are many experiments, controlled radiation levels inside chambers where you have radiation shielding, and then bacteria multiply much more rapidly. And there's a classic case in Taiwan. 2 buildings were built, similar buildings, apartment buildings, and it turned out that in one of them, the steel had been contaminated by somebody, unfortunately, dumping some cobalt-60 radioactive material, which is used to cure cancer, incidentally, and it got mixed into the steel. And I don't know how they found out, but they made measurements, and wow, the dose rate was much higher in this building than it was in that building. Oh, my goodness! And then they did some studies, and they found the health rates were higher in the building with the radioactive material in it. I am not recommending everybody go get yourself a good dose of radiation. But man grew up in a radioactive world, more radioactive in the past than now. And so our immune system seems to depend a little on that fact. And there's studies of people who were exposed to a higher radiation level because they live higher on a mountain and they get cosmic rays and stuff. And they live longer. So Fukushima, bad thing, very bad thing. But remember, it was a tsunami that was really the problem. Sure. And the fact that they ran out of fuel for the backup cooling system. So it was a bad thing. We remember that many other bad things have happened in the world. So I'm not saying, gee, isn't it great? I'm saying it was a terrible accident. Certainly, if you saw the movies, remember at the time when the houses were being swept out to sea by the tsunami and the boats, that was a very depressing sight that had nothing to do with the reactors being around.
That's true.
So now, one problem you have to worry about, of course, is the political problem. How do governments react when something happens? Do you tell the truth? Are you prepared to take action as necessary? Or do you sit back and say, oh, nothing happened, folks, nothing to worry about? Governments have been known to take that lighter attitude on occasion, not just about radiation, but a few other things that are going on. So Fukushima was a bad disaster, no question. But most of the problem came from the tsunami. And Japan, remember, was a country without oil, stuff like that. They needed nuclear power. And so we will... I should add that one of the things after the war that there was a commission set up and we did a lot of studying in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. People who'd have been exposed to radiation but didn't die, especially pregnant women. And to see how much of a problem was for the next generation. Because, oh my goodness, it'll affect the genetics and we're all going to have
horns,
kids who are in trouble, all kinds of problems. And it didn't work out that way. Much less problem than had been expected. So there's an important consideration here that people may not understand. The dose rate is very important. In other words, a big dose in a short time, you don't have a chance, your body doesn't have a chance to recover from that. A smaller dose over a much longer period of time, you can handle far more radiation that way. So I do not advocate people going out and taking a nice radiation bath, but I do want people to be realistic. And it's not as if burning coal and oil is good for you. You know what I'm saying. There are a lot of different considerations here.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's I've had a conversation with another person about that he was kind of on the synchronicity kind of understanding, and his perspective was possibly this is something that the human race is supposed to go through. And to hear that it actually helps people in certain ways live longer, that adds some credibility to his perspective that we were discussing.
Incidentally, about things nuclear, I better point out that one of the things that's happening is that every advanced civilization will know about the nuclear fusion because of the stars. And that means that they will recognize that we will be able to go to the stars pretty quickly. It's going to cost a lot of money to build a fusion propulsion system. I worked on one in 1962, as a matter of fact. But that means we're a threat to everybody in the neighborhood. And people don't seem to understand that the chemical rockets aren't the ultimate. Don't tell me it takes too much energy. It's like saying you can't get from Fredericton, New Brunswick, where I live, to San Francisco in less than a month because you can't walk fast enough. Well, I'll grab a couple airplanes and do it in less than a day. So fusion propulsion will get us out there. Won't be cheap, won't be easy, but undoubtedly others out there have done it already.
I was thinking maybe we could use some of that military budget. But maybe we are.
Good luck.
I guess it's possible. Yeah, good luck. I'm sure it's probably drones and fighters we don't need. Stan, we've been on the phone for about an hour. I do appreciate you coming on with us. I'm curious, would you like to stay on for a little bit? We've got some more questions.
Just a little bit. Okay.
Okay.
Sure.
Let me give you one more question, and maybe we'll end it on that one. This is a good one. We're curious what your latest project is that you've been working on.
Well, I've been thinking about the movie, but I'm talking with Kathleen Marden, with whom I wrote 2 other books, about another book, Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers. We're both so fed up with the false arguments made by the nasty, noisy negativists that we think it would be useful to document these. Take specific cases. Here's what the debunker said, and here's what the facts are. Big difference. And we don't get enough of that. Most of the coverage isn't very balanced, and the debunkers get away with the bloody murder. I mean, one of the explanations for Roswell by the head of the Committee for Scientific Investigation, boy, is that a misnomer. The explanation was that Roswell, oh yeah, that PR guy made up the story to get attention. He didn't even know his name. Now, the notion that Walter Haut, who'd flown 20 missions over Japan as a bombardier, and who dropped the instrument package over one of the nuclear weapons tests in 1946, would make up a story and put it out to the press is utterly ridiculous when you figure that the group at Roswell, and of course the noisy negativists never tell you this, was the most elite military group in the entire world, the 509th. They were the ones who dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and 2 more in the Pacific in Operation Crossroads in 46. No other military group in the world could compete with them. They had hand-picked officers, hand-picked men. Roswell, incidentally, has a 13,000-foot runway because of the big B-36 bombers that used to go in and out of there carrying nuclear weapons. In 47, in other words, they were the only military group in the entire world that had nuclear weapons. So to suggest that the PR guy made up the story. 9 years later, those guys, the cover of their magazine, Skeptical Inquirer, an unknown officer put out that story. Unknown. He's mentioned Walter Haut. I've been in his house, had meals with him. He's dead now, but pretty old guy. He's even older than I am. Not correcting that false impression is typical of the noisy negativists.
That's a good motto that you have is have your facts straight before you talk. It seems to be a recurring incident in most of this research that you're doing. Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate you joining us. Congratulations on your recent Lifetime Achievement Award. That's awesome.
I hope that doesn't mean they think I'm going to die right away.
Again, check out Mr. Friedman's website, stantonfriedman.com. There is a lot of information on there, links to articles, basically a rundown of everything that Stan's done. We'll keep an eye out for the Majestic 12 movie. I got to admit, I searched the internet up and down looking for an update on that before we got on the call to
Magic Man.
Magic Man.
Magic Man.
We've got our eyes out.
MAJIC. Don't
That
forget.
might have been where I missed, where I didn't find anything.
Sorry.
No problem. We appreciate it very much, and we hope to have you on again sometime.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much, Stan.
Okay.
Bye bye.
We'll do it. Thanks
Thank you.
much. Bye.